Right. Greetings from the Orlando Museum of Art. I'm David Matteson, the Associate Curator of Education and Outreach, and the facilitator of the book club that regularly meets at the museum. I hope you will join me on December 10th to discuss The Past is Never, a Southern Gothic that transports us through the Mississippi Delta to the swamps of Florida and through layers of mystery and lore as we follow siblings Willett and Bert as they seek the truth behind the disappearance of their sister, Pansy. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, the novel's author, Tiffany Quay Tyson. Tiffany is a native of Jackson, Mississippi. After college, she worked as a newspaper reporter in the Mississippi Delta, where she received the Frank Allen Award for Journalism. She is the recipient of 2 Heartland Emmy Awards, including one for writing a children's public television program. She is the author of 2 novels, 3 Rivers and The Past is Never, winner of the Willie Morris Award for Southern Fiction, the Janet Heidinger Kafka Prize, the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award for Fiction, the Mississippi Author Award. She is a faculty member at Lighthouse Writers Workshop and the Lighthouse Young Writers Program. She currently lives in Denver, Colorado. Welcome, Tiffany.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm just so grateful to you for accepting this invitation to discuss your novel, The Past is Never.
I'm really happy to be here.
Yay. It's really a beautifully written story. It's so textured. And one of the things that I fell in love with were the characters that you created. They are so challenging, so complex. And they often, you've developed these kind of beautiful backstories or well researched backstories for each of them. And often those stories lead them on something of a tragic trajectory. Could you begin by just sharing a little bit more about the characters that you created and maybe who inspired them?
Yeah, and well, I will start by saying that I'm not sure who inspires my characters except for like maybe everyone I ever meet, but also maybe no one in particular. I'm kind of a sponge, and there's no doubt that these characters were inspired somewhat by people that I knew when I was growing up, people in my family, people in my community in Mississippi. Bert in particular, her name, so it's Bert, but she's a girl, and when we start, she's kind of a young girl. And her real name is Roberta Lynn, her full name is, but she goes by Bert. And that, she is really, like, I sort of got her voice in my head, and that was the reason I set off on this story. I'm definitely the sort of writer who would talk to herself all the time and has a lot of voices in her head, and would probably be locked up for being insane if I weren't writing novels. So I accept that about myself, and it's fine. But Bert in particular came to me, and she had this very sort of strong narrative voice, and I just knew that I wanted to spend more time with her and kind of see where she took me. And she was a little bit inspired and sort of an homage to the books that I read when I was her age, when this book starts. When the book starts, she's young. So, all of those sort of spunky, sassy, adventurous, curious girls like Harriet the Spy and Laura Ingalls and Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird. Like, I just loved these characters when I was first reading books myself. And so I did want to write one. I just thought that would be a great challenge to set for myself. And the more time I spent with her, the more I felt like she could handle it. She was up to the challenge. And so she's really the primary character and certainly the narrator of the novel. But then there's also, this other cast of characters. There's her brother, Willett. I do not have an older brother, but I had all these older cousins and older boys in the neighborhood. And I just sort of remember how great it was when they would pay the younger girls some attention, only because they seemed so like fearless and brave and I don't know, inappropriate sometimes in ways that we weren't allowed to be. And I think Willett sort of was inspired by my interactions with older boys when I was younger. I mean, they really, taught me how to like jump over the crevice and like run across the logs and not be afraid. And so I really wanted Bert to have that experience as well. Some of the other characters, I don't know where they come from. I mean, one of my favorite characters in this particular novel is Granny Clem, who
Yep.
ends up serving as sort of the matriarch of the family. She does have a very rich backstory, which we learn as the novel progresses. She was in many ways expected to be a particular type of woman, particularly growing up in the South, but also in the era in which she was raised. And she very much rebels against that and does not end up being that sort of woman at all. And yet she is, in fact, nurturing, feminine, and she's, both unexpected and also exactly what you need her to be, I feel like, or what Bert needs her to be throughout the
Mhm.
novel. Um, I'm more interested in people who are complicated than I am in people who are easy. Like I'm not all that interested in anyone who is all good or anyone who is evil. Which kind of leads
Yeah.
me to the father in this novel, who I think is maybe the most complicated. And he's actually absent through almost the entire novel, but we learn a little bit about his history. And I just feel like he's a super complicated character. He does some things that are hard to understand. And part of my challenge as a writer, I think, when writing a character who is hard to love, is to find a way to love that character. And I can only do that by actually getting to know the character really well, which I think is where all of that backstory comes in. I mean, even if there's backstory that didn't make it into the book, there's things that I
Oh,
wrote,
really? Okay.
yeah, where I'm just sort of discovering the characters. And in particular with the characters who do some things that seem a little less than ethical or, problematic, I have to find a way to love them for it, or else I
Mm.
think the reader will see that they're not true. And that's kind of my whole, that's my whole thing in creating a character that's as complex as the father is, or Granny Clem, frankly, also very
Yeah, I
complicated.
was gonna say that because
Mhm.
Granny Clem's an interesting one, and I think for certain people, her story is going to draw up, for certain readers, draw up some moral quandaries in them, right? Because exactly what you said, she's not exactly who you expect or who you would think of in this role of this Southern matriarch almost for this family, but just a fascinating character overall. And I mean, I wrestled with her story reading this
Yeah,
book.
absolutely. She does some things that are really questionable, but I think she does them for reasons that make sense to her. I mean, even if it wouldn't square it for everybody, I think it squares it for her. And I also think that she just knows that the world is not black and white. Like sometimes you
Mm.
have to wallow in the gray a little bit, and she's willing to do that. And everything she does kind of to help other people. It's not always the help they need. It's maybe not even always the help they want. But in her mind, I think she believes she's doing the right thing. Um, and yeah, I think that it can be difficult to find a way into characters like that. But I think the best way is really just like I said, I just can't write a character who's just purely bad or purely
Mhm.
evil, because it just is so flat. And so I try to understand the motivations behind what characters do. And that's where all of that sort of complex backstory comes in. Yeah.
So I'm interested a little bit more about your research process there. So do you start with characters and because they're so vivid in this
Yeah.
novel, or do you start really with setting because that's another aspect that just makes this book come to life?
Thank you. Yeah, I actually think that setting is character, basically. I
Mm.
mean, like it is another character and it needs to be as lively and active and influential on the story as a character would be. And particularly when you're talking about the South. I mean, I just think the South is such a rich, I grew up in the South, of course, and it wasn't really until I moved away that I started, I don't know, interrogating my own feelings about it in a way that was meaningful. But I just feel like the setting, particularly when we're talking about Southern stories, matters just as much as the characters. And I feel like the setting is just as active and, exerts just as much influence on the course of the story and on the course of these characters' lives as do the characters' decisions. Um,
Well, I love that because we're reading your book in connection with an exhibition of the photographer Clyde Butcher's work. And Clyde creates these stunning large scale black and white images of the Florida Everglades that just when you're standing in front of them, transport you there, have that ability to just take you away and enmesh you in this gorgeous setting. And it's a similar effect to what I feel like you achieve in your book. And then I also just wanted to kind of touch on that notion maybe a little bit more about Southern identity, what you were getting to as a writer who is from the South, who writes about the South. I'll just share a little anecdote. I was listening to your book again this past weekend. I was on a road trip with a friend of mine who is from the South. And he fell in love. I mean, he was hooked from the first few pages of just those beautiful descriptions, right? Those sensory descriptions of Southern culture and Southern traditions, the foods. I mean, you can smell and taste the South when you're reading your book, and it's just so engaging, right? Enticing and evocative. And he loved that. And then we got to some of those more difficult scenes. I'm thinking specifically of the history of the quarry, some of the history surrounding Granny Clem and some of the other characters like Junior and Fern. And he wrestled with that. And I was nervous about how he would maybe handle some of these issues surrounding race and racism and this kind of long shadow of slavery within the South. But he took it really well. And we actually had this incredibly frank conversation about his own Southern identity. And so that's a long-winded way of asking you, what are some of the challenges maybe that you have faced in writing about the South, and especially in this current kind of cultural climate?
Yeah. I think, much like I was saying about the difficult characters, you have to find a way to sort of love them onto the page or else they fall flat. I feel the same way about the South. And, I grew up in the South. I am not in any way blind to the problems of the South. Obviously, I write about them, but I also don't think that the South is, I don't think that the South is a terrible place, a completely terrible place. There's a lot of dichotomy there. The history is awful. And it needs to be confronted, and we all need to own up to it and stop sweeping it under the rug, which I think we kind of have a tendency to do, particularly as Southerners. But there are so many things about the South, so many things that have come out of the South that are worth loving, right? And certainly I love food. I love to cook. I love to eat. The food is an easy entree for me, and I feel like an easy entree for most readers. It is eating and cooking and baking, it's all very sensual and meaningful, and a way of expressing different things, but particularly expressing love. And so for me, that's like an easy entree into almost any world is the food, which is why I think I'm constantly having my characters eat or cook something. But there's other things too, and I think that it helped for me to move away from the South. I think that gave me sort of distance and perspective. And, when I first left the South, I think I was actually a little bit angry at the South. I was a little, I'm so tired of this place and these narrow ideas and, everybody pretending like things are one way when they're so clearly another. And I did have that, I had a little bit of that anger inside me when I left. But then I think a few years later, I was living in Austin, Texas at the time, and a guy, who was serving on a board of a place that I was working, asked me where I was from originally. And I said, oh, I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. And he said, I swear, that must have been terrible. That was his first. And I immediately was like, don't you dare. You know what I mean? Like, I really got my back up about it. And that was the moment when I realized, oh, okay, I do still love this place, even though it sometimes made me angry, even though I left, and I was able to start thinking about the South and its history, and also all of the great, the wonderful things that it has given to the world in a way that was more nuanced, more complicated, I think more interesting. And again, a way that helped me to sort of love the South back onto the page, as opposed to just looking at it with anger or resentment or all of the things that I might. Also, I will say that many of the people I love most in this world still live in the South. And it doesn't do, you can't hate the place that the people you love spring from. And I sprang from there too. If I hate it, then do I hate myself? I mean, on some level, probably. And so
Mhm.
I think that's really an important part of putting any place on the page, whether it's a real place, or whether it's a fictional place. If you're writing about another world in outer space, you still have to know it well enough to love it and also see its flaws and see its faults. I think that's the work of writing.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I can certainly feel, as I grew up in Orlando, Florida, and I feel a real pride in being a Floridian, which is such a strange thing, right? We don't have a lot of native Floridians, but so many people move to this area. But I hear you in terms of that pride, that sense of connection with the place that you called home. And so I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. I will say, so in addition to food, literature is, of course, a really important part of Southern culture. And your book is participating, your book, along with others, participating in the Southern Gothic tradition. And so I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more, maybe on the book's title, where that comes from, and maybe some of the ways that other Southern Gothic artists or authors have really influenced you.
Well, the past is never is from a Faulkner quote. And so Faulkner says, in the South, the past is never dead, it is an even past. And that was when I was trying to think of titles for this book. I'm really not great at titles. It's not not my strongest point. That quote was the thing that kept coming up, because I think the book really deals with this idea that generation after generation after generation, we are dealing with both the sins and the gifts of our ancestors. And you don't even have to know the history to kind of feel it in your bones and to have it have an effect, a real effect on you. And I believe that. I think that is probably true for everyone, doesn't matter where you're from. And so that is the idea that the past never dies, the idea that it never goes away, was really like something that kept recurring and recurring and recurring as I was writing it, which is how I ended up choosing the title. So it is a little bit of an homage to another Southern writer, to Faulkner, who I think most people think of as sort of the quintessential Southern writer. But I also, of course, I was raised in Mississippi schools. And so I read, and people everywhere read these books, but I think maybe not in the same way that we read them. And so I read, Eudora Welty and Elizabeth Spencer, all of these wonderful Southern writers who write about Southern society and Southern families in ways that are realistic and that feel true, but also like they sort of plumb the depths of the darker side of things. And I'm fascinated by that. Flannery O'Connor is a huge influence, of course. I mean, I am fascinated by this idea that what something looks like on the surface is not necessarily what it is. There's this whole history behind all of us. There's this whole history behind every place. And the families that put themselves out, like on Instagram or whatever, all these little families where they're all dressed alike and they look happy and perfect and polished. You just know they're not, right? Like, to me, that's the most suspicious.
You totally do. Yeah, it is.
I have no faith in those people to not just stab each other in their sleep. And so I know it's horrible. But that's kind of how I feel about the world, like the more somebody tries to be proper and prim and perfect.
Well, the superficial, right? You go far beyond the superficial and really give us great depths in terms of the characters, in terms of the sense of place. And that's the beauty of this book, is the mystery of those plummets, of that depth.
And I think that's the great tradition of Southern literature. I think that, when you read Faulkner, when you read The Sound and the Fury, and you see this family dealing with kind of these horrific things that they can't even talk about, like they're talking around all of the horror all the time. I mean, that to me just reads as so real and honest and true. And I'm no Faulkner at all, but I love that instinct that he has, that way he has of really plumbing the depths of something that no one
Oh, I
wants
could
to talk about.
definitely hear Faulkner, and I could definitely hear Flannery O'Connor. So again, thank you. This is a beautiful book. I'm so excited to be sharing it with our book club group. Do you want to read a little sample of it for us?
I will, absolutely.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, I picked a little passage, it's pretty short, from when Bert and Willett have traveled from Mississippi to Everglades City in Florida, looking for information about their father. And so they're a little bit older now. This is the very first time that they go out on the water, and the water plays a big role in this book, but they go out on the water in a canoe for the very first time. And I'll just leave it there and read a little bit. We paddled through the shadowy tunnels and shallow, murky water of the Turner River. A large turtle perched on a stump. It pulled its head in when our paddles came too close. Cypress knees jutted out of the brown water, and plants seemed to grow right out of the air. Birds landed in the trees around us, squawking and flapping. I later learned to identify the swamp chicken, the osprey, and my favorite, the anhinga. I liked the way it perched on a branch with its wings extended, like Jesus on the cross. We took Iggy's advice and used our monkey arms to pull the boat through the low canopy of branches. The mangrove trees grew sideways as much as they grew tall, and in places where the water was shallow, I could see the roots were a tangled, vine-like mass. We floated for a moment in a still pool surrounded by grass. It was hot for the middle of January. Mosquitoes buzzed. A fish splashed up from the water. A bird called out from the trees. A spider spun a golden web across a fallen stump. Everywhere I looked, the air was thick and heavy and full of life. We floated through a swarm of gnats, and I nearly dropped my paddle to swat them away. Leaves and branches and bits of hanging moss seemed to reach out and caress us as we paddled by. Tree trunks crawled with fluorescent patches of green moss. We were a few paddle strokes from the Gulf of Mexico, where the brackish waters swam with black-tipped sharks, stingrays, barracuda, and jellyfish. There were alligators in the river and snakes along the bank. The water smelled ripe and alive. The way forward and the way back seemed familiar and brand new at the same time. With nothing more than a shift of light and shadow, everything became transformed. Was that the same strand of cedars we passed on our way in, or had the trees sprouted up in response to some strange prayer? I reached out to touch a jutting cypress knee, and when I pulled my hand back, the tip of my finger swelled with a bead of blood. I didn't know if I'd scraped against a thorn or been stung by one of the hundreds of swarming, buzzing insects. Iggy was right. It would be easy to disappear into the swamps or into the Gulf. Who would search for you out here, where everything was beautiful and dangerous and strange?
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I love the passages about the Everglades, I will say, because I think you do a beautiful job of merging the dangers of the Everglades with its just sublime qualities.
Yeah.
You really do transport us there as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your beautiful book, The Past Is Never, with us. Again, we'll be sharing this with our museum's book club on December 10th. I encourage you to join us for that. And for more on The Past Is Never, our book club, and the exhibition Cathedrals of Florida, Masterworks by Clyde Butcher, please visit our website, omart.org. Thanks for watching.